On the surface, Israel and Saudi Arabia are enemies. They don't share borders, or values, or culture. In fact, decades ago, Saudi officials even claimed that Jews drink blood and plan 9/11. We don't, and we didn't, but hey, never let the facts get in the way of a good story, right? But behind closed doors, the two countries have been secretly working together for years.
What? That's right.
So what's the story behind Saudi Arabia and Israel's secret relationship? Before Israel even became a country, David Ben-Gurion was looking for potential allies, including Saudi Arabia. As he saw it, the Saudis were pragmatists. They didn't want other Arab countries to have too much power in the region, and the presence of a friendly state like Israel could possibly advance Saudi Arabia's interests. But King Ibn Saud wasn't having it. He rebuffed every attempt to make contact, and even sent troops to fight against Israel in its war of independence. The Arab states never quite forgave Israel for winning that war and, continuing to exist. In fact, at times, that anger seemed to be the only thing that united them, and that opened quite an opportunity for Israel. See, the more the Arab states sniped at each other, the easier it was for Israel to make contact. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, Regional conflict is common in the Middle East. Every country is looking out for its own interests. And that means that sometimes, sworn enemies find themselves on the same side of a conflict. And that's exactly what happened to Israel and Saudi Arabia in the early 1960s, when civil war broke out in Yemen. Rebels had just overthrown the government, and the country was a hot mess. Most of the countries in the region were not fans of the rebels. That included Saudi Arabia and Israel. In fact, Saudi Arabia even quietly opened its airspace to the Israeli planes that dropped aid to Yemeni government fighters. Now, the two countries weren't exactly allies. There's no evidence that they were even talking to each other. And that airspace deal was probably brokered by a go-between. A third country that had friendly relationships with both the Saudis and the Israelis. Nevertheless, the crisis in Yemen was an important milestone, because it was the first time that Saudi and Israeli interests aligned so obviously. And it wouldn't be the last. But the two countries had a long way to go. In 1967, the entire Arab League formally adopted the Khartoum Resolution, aka the Three No's. Together they pledged no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. Behind the scenes though, Israel was working overtime to build bridges. The Mossad stopped an Egyptian plot to assassinate the Jordanian king. They passed on information about local attempts to overthrow the Saudi government. And when a would-be assassin targeted the Saudi prince, Israel told the Saudis all about that too. But how do you even start back-channel communications? Carrier pigeon? Singing telegram?
Hello there, I have a singing telegram.
Close. Lucky for Israelis and Saudis alike, very few things can get in the way of cold, hard cash. And the fabulously wealthy Saudi businessman Adnan Khashoggi wasn't going to let a bunch of politicians ruin his business dealings. If he wanted to do business with Israelis, then no one was going to stop him. And if those Israelis happened to have high-level connections, well, what a lucky coincidence for everyone involved. So when he wasn't living la vida loca, Khashoggi was facilitating the flow of information between his home country and the Jewish state. Ben-Gurion had been right all along. The Saudis were pragmatists. It just took them a couple of decades to see what the Jewish state had been saying since 1948. We're here to stay. In fact, in 1977, the Saudi king admitted that no one was trying to wipe Israel off the map anymore, which is more or less a declaration of eternal love if you're an Arab state in the 70s. But the Israeli Foreign Ministry remained silent. If the Saudis wanted to talk, they'd have to make the first move. Which they did. Not directly, of course. No other Arab state had officially recognized Israel, and the Saudis weren't necessarily trying to be the first. Still, they sent a couple of letters proposing meetings. But the Israelis were wary, demanding to know in advance what the Saudis wanted. The Saudis were cagey, and the conversation fell through. Later, it turned out that they were about to ask Israel to stop lobbying against the sale of F-15 jets from the Americans. Since the talks never happened, it's not clear what they were offering in return. But in 1981, the Saudi prince sent Israel a concrete proposal. If Israel withdrew from all the territories it acquired during the Six-Day War and handed over Jerusalem to be the capital of a Palestinian state, the region would be at peace. Sounds amazing, right? So why didn't it happen? Well, Israel's prime minister basically laughed in the Saudis' faces. He rejected the offer immediately, adding a few spicy words about the Saudis themselves, Stuff like, you live in a desert country where there is still discrimination from the Middle Ages, with the chopping off of hands and heads, with corruption that screams to the heavens.
Them's fighting words.
But why would the Prime Minister refuse so strongly? Wasn't Israel interested in peace? It was, but giving up Jerusalem was a non-starter for even the most liberal Israeli leaders. It's simply too important to too many people. Plus, this was 1981, and Israel was under constant attack from the PLO, attacks that the government hadn't been able to stop. If they withdrew from certain territories, they'd find themselves even more vulnerable. And after decades of rejection and war, it wasn't clear that the Saudis could actually provide the peace that they were promising. So the plan didn't go through. But a decade later, the Saudis and the Israelis found themselves on the same side yet again. Both were being targeted by Saddam Hussein, who had invaded his neighbor and simply refused to leave. Much of the world watched this invasion with alarm.
The White House is condemning the invasion, calling for Iraq to withdraw its forces immediately.
It is a prescription for war, this Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the tiny country that is a primary source of oil.
Arab governments were particularly concerned. What if Saddam turned to them next, trying to take their oil? After all, he had already invaded 2 of his neighbors. So Saudi Arabia joined a coalition of more than 30 countries to pressure him to leave Kuwait. In response, he shot missiles at Israel, thinking that if Israel retaliated, all the Arab countries in the coalition would switch sides. He reasoned that no Arab country wanted to fight on the same side as the Jewish state. But he was wrong. To start, Israel didn't retaliate, so no Arab states had to decide whether they'd pull out of the anti-Sadam coalition. Plus, he assumed that all states were driven by petty tribalism rather than high-level diplomatic interests. Like we keep saying, countries have interests, not friends. And it's not in anyone's interest to just let a dictator just keep on invading countries without any pushback. It definitely wasn't in the Saudis' interests to let Saddam just keep at it, especially since their army and their country took the hardest hits from his missiles. The times, they were changing. Later that year, the Saudis and the Israelis sat in the same room for the first time at the Madrid Peace Conference, which was a joint effort by the US and USSR to end the Arab-Israeli conflict once and for all. It was a momentous occasion, and no one batted an eye when Israeli and Saudi representatives talked at length. No peace came out of the Madrid Peace Conference, but the relationship between Saudi and Israel was warming, and behind closed doors, Saudis and Israelis kept talking about joint projects that would bring in money if they could just nail down a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Once there was an independent Palestinian state, the Saudis would consider building a pipeline that would bring natural gas from the West Bank to the Saudi kingdom. In 2002, the Saudis repeated their offer from 1981. Withdraw from all the territories you won in 1967, give up Jerusalem, and the Arab world would make peace. But again, it was a no-go. The Second Intifada was raging, and Israelis were dying on the daily from Palestinian suicide bombs. The Israeli government wasn't going to give up territory without some concrete guarantees. It took another war to bring the Jewish state back to the negotiating table. When the Iran-backed terror group Hezbollah kidnapped 2 Israeli soldiers in the summer of 2006, Israel responded with a massive show of force. But even though much of Lebanon lay in ruins at the end of the war, Hezbollah still existed. The terror group was stronger and more powerful than anyone had realized, and that meant that Iran could do serious damage if it chose, which put Saudi Arabia and Israel in the same precarious boat. Both countries were directly threatened by the Islamic Republic of Iran. Finally, they had a shared interest strong enough to get them talking directly, curbing Iran. So they sat down for a chat, for the first time without an intermediary. Saudi princes met directly with the Israeli Prime Minister and the head of the Mossad to discuss how they were going to stop the Iranian regime. Both parties denied they were in contact, but the cat was out the bag. And when the Arab Spring ripped through the Middle East, leaving many countries in chaos, the Israeli government began to see Saudi Arabia as an important advocate for regional stability. Within the decade, Israeli officials were hinting that they were allied with a certain Arab state against Iran. It was an open secret that certain Arab states was code for Saudi Arabia, among others. Well, some of those others were ready to make it official. In 2020, the United States brokered a historic agreement between Israel and multiple Arab countries, 2 of which border Saudi Arabia. And though the Saudis weren't part of the deal, there were hints that they too might normalize relations with Israel. To start, They allowed the accords to go through. The agreements were a pretty good barometer of public opinion. If they went well in other Gulf states, well, that would be even more incentive for the Saudis to sign a potential normalization deal with Israel. In the meantime, they let other countries fly over their airspace en route to Israel and hinted that a normalization deal would come once Israel worked out its problems with the Palestinians. But that last condition wasn't a deal breaker. In 2023, the Saudis openly stated that they were willing to normalize ties with Israel.
What would it take for you to agree to normalize relations with Israel?
Every day we get closer. It seems it's for the first time real one, serious. We're gonna see how it goes.
From Israel's perspective, things were looking good until October 7th. Many analysts have suggested that Hamas's devastating attack on Israel was engineered to tank a potential deal between Israel and the Saudis.
Hamas right now is attempting to block the Saudi-Israel rapprochement.
If that's true, well, it seemed to be working. The war between Israel and Hamas has cost tens of thousands of lives, and the entire Arab world has harshly criticized Israel's response to Hamas.
I condemn Israel's indiscriminate bombing of Palestinian innocent civilians in Gaza and the attempt to forcibly drive them into Sinai.
We say enough. Israel should not be given an unconditional green light for killing, and we cannot ignore the occupation and the siege.
But when Iran attacked Israel in April of 2024, multiple Arab countries came to Israel's defense, including some that have no public ties to the Jewish state. Some passed on intelligence or allowed Israel to use their airspace. Others took a more active role, helping to track or even intercept the Iranian missiles. Saudi Arabia has publicly denied any involvement. Whether they were involved is anyone's guess. Nobody knows exactly what will happen next, but one thing is certain. The Iranian regime is a threat to the region's stability, and a Saudi-Israeli alliance benefits both countries enormously. They're both significant regional powers, and their deal might just bring the region some much-needed stability, maybe even a lasting peace. Their relationship has been an open secret for years. The only question is, when will it go public at last?